All right, so what are we doing today? As Laurent said, we're going to be looking at a recap of Google I/O 2021, specifically through the eyes of our main interest. Well, I'm supposing for people in this room, Android development. So there's been a ton of stuff that was announced at Google I/O as usual. Maybe a bit of a different year, as we'll see. Like a lot of the stuff that's been announced, it feels like with the pandemic and everybody being at home, there's a lot of, I don't know, like list checking that's going on, a lot of little things getting fixed left and right. Anyway, so we're gonna look at the new features coming to Android 12, some of the more interesting changes, I should say, because there's a lot of stuff and it's not all, well, I didn't find it all interesting. It's through my lens. So sorry in advance if I skip over whatever you love. We can talk about it at the end. And we're going to do towards the end a live exploration of the new features and changes to Android Studio, and starting with Arctic Fox. So anybody that's doing day development with the platform is probably going to have seen some of this before, but Google I/O being what it is and how open Google are with everything that they work on, it's no surprise that we're already aware of some of these things. But we're going to take a look at it together, and then it might open up the floor for discussion at the end if anybody's interested. I know that it's a bit different when we're remote, but anyway. All right, so Android 12. I'm going to go over really quickly the stuff. We're not going to look into too much. So Android 12, what we got this year, we got like a lot of deprecations on certain APIs. We got a bunch of security improvements as pretty much every year. So specifically, the things that I've taken note of are the concept of approximate location. So there's going to be this new permission in the system where we're going to be able to ask the users to just find out where they approximately are location-wise, which is a nice permission to be able to ask, because if you don't necessarily specifically want to know on what street the user is, but you need to know if they're, I don't know, in Montreal or in the province of Quebec, to offer them travel services or things like that, then that's a nice way of, not making the user stress out about sharing their location too much. There's a new bunch of foreground service restrictions coming to sort of keep things under control. What used to happen is that services would ask for foreground access to launch stuff, and that would impair battery life and all these things. So that's been improved a whole lot. Render script got deprecated. So if you even know what that is, that used to be our way of running effectively GPU compute type code. So what that means is that we used to be able to use this render script API to execute code that would run fast. You probably don't know about this stuff because it's not very useful on a day-to-day basis. Like, it was used mostly for processing photos in a very quick way, or sometimes to do some sort of background or screensaver type generation, wallpaper, dynamic wallpapers and things like that. That's been deprecated. There's those ways of doing this, but we're not necessarily going to cover that today. System UI changes. You've probably seen the demos. There's like a new over scroll bounce. We're not going to talk too much about that. It's a bit controversial, but whatever. Another thing I'm not going to talk too much about, but that's worth mentioning, is the app splash screens. So now on Android, we have apps splash screens, which we didn't really officially used to have. People would code their own. So now there's this nice new transition when you click an icon. As far as I understand it, I haven't seen a whole lot of videos showing it off, but we're going to get the zoom effect from the SVG of the icon of our app. So you have to have an icon of your app that's in SVG. That's going to zoom in and transition into your app. There's certain conditions to make that work, but that's, left to the reader to go and check that stuff out. It's fairly simple, but nice little improvements. All right, so, but some features caught my eye more than others, and then we're going to start. That was pretty much the laundry list of things I did not cover yet. Compatible media transcoding, so new ways of transferring files. Performance classes, we're going to have like different performance classes of Android phones now. So you're actually going to be able to say, is this device Android 12 ready, which basically means you'll be able to ask the device if it's powerful enough to run certain things. Again, mostly if you're concerned with video and you want to know how good the device is, that's going to be a way of finding that out. And a few other little improvements with the multimedia capabilities of Android 12. All right. I've talked about briefly the difference with location changes. That impacts Bluetooth specifically as well. So now you'll be able to have this dialog pop up. Basically, you're going to be able to specifically ask the user if they allow for Bluetooth to be turned on. Like, it's not going to ask the user for Bluetooth access. It's going to ask the user for, hey, I'd like to find devices near me, and do you allow me to do this? And that will enable the location services that Bluetooth has to sort of, and all the different little interfaces that allow you to sort of scan your environment. And that's a clearer way of asking the user. So that should be good if you're using any of those types of features. It's going to be easier to convince the user to let you have at it. Right. And with multimedia handling, this one is a kind of an interesting one. This is a new feature where you'll be able to basically copy paste pictures and more, maybe even animated GIFs and things like that. So we're seeing here how you'll be able to copy paste images from one app to another and drop that into a text edit box, for example. So a lot of nice little rich interactions will be possible with this new API. So that's all new and coming with Android 12. And now we're going to get into the meat of the matter, like the bigger features that are coming, the more obvious stuff is the theming. So what we're seeing here is an example of what happens when our users are going to say, okay, cool, I'm going to use this wallpaper now. It's got all these nice shades of green. The system is going to be able now to automatically detect the palette from your background and sort of turn that into the official skin of the phone. So as you can see here, that's going to look really, really neat. But that also implies that you as a developer are going to have to find a way to tap into that, and when it makes sense, convert your own look and feel of your app to match these colors. And this is now called Material U. So to be absolutely honest, I'm a bit skeptical with this. I totally get the idea, and I'm not too sure though that if you're working for a big company that has like a very fixed branding, that you're gonna want to necessarily skin your app in a different way. So if you're a Shopify or a Transit and your your colors are basically white and green, and the user likes, I don't know, pink and blue, hot pink and blue, you're not necessarily going to skin your app to change your look, right? It's going to be a bit confusing. But if you think about it, where it would make sense is with widgets. Now, there's a big overhaul of widgets. I think it's one of the bigger features coming with Android 12. This stuff is pretty interesting. So we're going to run through a few of the different opportunities that have come to us and the new capabilities that we get with Android 12. Before we dig in, though, you might be asking, well, that's nice. I don't have a widget. Why should I care? And the thing is, if you don't have a widget, here are some maybe surprising stats. The majority of users have at least one widget, and more than 60% of people have multiple widgets on their launch screen. Now, that's actually a very big deal, because if you think about it, the modern mobile environment that we live in as developers, it's not as easy as it used to be to sort of get your users' eyeballs, right? Like, engagement is king. And the only people right now, like only the major apps really have a lot of engagement with the users, right? The Twitters of the world and all of that. So if you as a smaller developer or as a different product want to engage your users, you kind of want to use all the tools available, all the tools at your disposal. Widgets are really powerful because once the user has put your app on the front screen, it's been also shown in other studies that the engagement of that user and the amount of time they'll spend with your app every day is going to go way up. Like one of the stats that went by really quickly during I/O was that they did this for Google Keep a while back. And when they upgraded the widget, they noticed that when people actually install it, the engagement goes up by something like a factor of 3. So that's really huge. So now that we have all these new widgets and this new look, it's definitely time to revisit the idea, should my app have a widget and surface my functionalities right on the home screen? So how does this look? So this is the new look. We can see basically that the new widgets integrate a whole lot better with a user's color theme. Like here you can guess that the color theme is based on the background that we see, this sort of pink and purple going on, right? We can see that the widgets themselves are like the markup color in day or light mode are basically this purple, and then in dark mode we're using the other extreme of that palette, the pinky sort of pink fleshy type color right there. Other things that we can notice is that those widgets look a lot cuter. They have rounded edges and things like that, but we're going to get to that in a second. So if we start just with dynamic colors, though, it's very simple to actually get access to the system colors, which will now be mapped to whatever the user's background is, depending on how the user configures their device. So if you want to benefit from these changes, all you need to do is say to Android, okay, give me the system colors, and I'll use those. So you're basically giving up a little bit on the skinning of your app, your own color theme. But as far as the widgets go, I think that's an important trade-off. Basically, users are going to know what widget they installed. You'll have to find other ways to sort of express your brand, but it'll be pretty important to sort of match the user's color scheme now, because that's going to be system-wide what the users expect. So if you want to integrate nicely, there's going to be a fair, a little bit of thinking that's going to have to go into that design right there. Other things to note with widgets. So there's these new rounded corners. Again, that you'll get from the system. So because technically, Android being what it is, these values can change. So the radius of the rounded corners might change. So what you want to do is just get them from the system. Now there's the idea that the background radius for the outside of the box, and for internal cards is different. So that's why those two are here. So you're going to want to use those. Other things that have been brought to widgets, they're going to be easier to customize and personalize. So that has been improved. So we can sort of see the affordances here on the screen. Those are shown to us when somebody does a long press. So we can, as developers of widgets, decide to offer that little pencil button, the editor button, which will basically say, okay, my widget is reconfigurable, user press on this. That's through the flags that you see here in the XML that you can say that to Android 12. And other things that are changing with widgets in Android 12, we have new compound buttons, which we did not have before. Now, I have to admit, like last time I worked with widgets, I don't even think I tried to have any type of check marks. I wasn't really aware of this consciously. Now, the thing that you have to know about widgets is that they don't technically have a state of their own, right? They're dependent on your app. So whenever users interact with widgets, there's a few more steps going on. Your app's not necessarily running in the background, things like that. So you have to be very mindful of when you're going to be using these compound buttons to flip the states in the proper way, propagate those changes to your app and back and forth. There's a few examples and coding samples out there. It's not that hard, but it's slightly different from what you might be used to. Now, what else? Right. So no images for these little things. So there's a few other subjects that have changed, a few other things that have been improved with widgets. There's an improved widget picker now. So that's interesting because what basically Google is doing is they're trying to surface these new widgets to the user in Android 12. So that means that the discovery is going to be a lot easier. There's going to be a concept of a previewable widget. So when users are going to scroll through this widget list that we already have, right? You probably remember there's a widget picker in the system somewhere if you ever used them. But basically, those are going to be a bit better now. The previews are going to be improved. Other things that have, I think, changed, but I'm not too sure if this is entirely new, but they're worth mentioning, is that you can plug a widget in the Assistant, the Google Assistant. You can connect your widgets with the Google Assistant. So the Google Assistant is going to propose those and help with discovery. And there's also apparently going to be support for surfacing widgets in Android Auto, which I have to be honest, I'm pretty curious as what that would look like, because as far as I can remember, you can't really push affordances into Android Auto. It's not something I've looked into very deeply. Maybe somebody at the end of the talk that knows more than me on this subject can chime in, but that's something to look for. The other thing that's more maybe interesting immediately for people who are more used to develop for the phones is that there's voice support now for home screen usage. So that's also kind of interesting. You can there's ways of making your widgets react to voice commands and things like that, which you would think, is kind of dovetails into the whole assistant thing. Other things worth mentioning: smoother transitions between widgets and apps. So you just need to share a proper ID between your widget and your app. It does require you to launch an activity when somebody interacts with the widget. But somebody's okay. Are we good? Yeah. Somebody should mute me. So I don't know where we're getting this from. I think maybe
I fix it. Oh, I can mute people.
You have all the controls. Thank you. Right, so slightly distracted. Smoother transitions, I've just talked about this. So there's ways of making sure that your widget will open up really nicely and have a nice transition animation, but you need to make sure to point to the right target in your app activities. And oh yeah, the last subject that's kind of interesting, they skipped over that really quickly during the different IO talks, but you might notice that a lot of the widget stuff is XML, and we haven't seen anything about Compose. Apparently, the Compose lib for widgets is coming. The way I've listened to the talks, I got the impression they didn't have time to finish it, or maybe they were waiting for certain things to stabilize in Compose, or didn't know how to handle it. Anyway, what they've said is that the beta for Compose library that will help you work with widgets is coming later this year, perhaps this summer. TBD. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, I'm gonna try and we're gonna go through a few of these things, but I'm gonna try not to bore anybody to death because there's a lot of stuff that went on at I/O. Kotlin, Kotlin adoption is doing great. Funny statistic about Kotlin's, they've run the numbers, and apparently apps that use Kotlin have a 10% less crashes than apps that use Java. So apparently type safety and structured concurrency are really, really good, which is not surprising if you're a Kotlin developer, but if you're still on Java, that's like a data point that you can bring up to your team if you are interested in trying out the new language on the platform. Kotlin Gradle DSL. So the DSL for the Kotlin Gradle plugin now has a new page documenting how it works. They've made a few improvements also as to how you interact with. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, like usually your Gradle files are built in Groovy. So that's your typical build.gradle. But you can rename those into build.gradle.kts. And then when you do that, instead of using Groovy as the language to define your build, you're going to start using Kotlin. And the thing is that the interfaces and the API changes slightly when you use KTS. Because if you remember, Groovy is just like another JVM language that has its own syntax and its own way of saving you time. And if you start using Kotlin with these APIs, sometimes it used to be a bit clunky when you wanted to assign values or assign list of values and things like that. So they've upgraded that, and they've sort of made that a little bit better, and they've added a lot of documentation on the Android Dev website to help you sort of figure out how to use this new Kotlin DSL. There's a lot of build time improvements in Kotlin nowadays. One of the big pain points with Kotlin is the KAPT incremental compilation. If you've ever had to work with a big project, that's kind of slow when you have annotations in your project and you need to run the annotation processor. So that's getting a lot better. There's a lot more caching involved. Kotlin Gradle caches the different configs, so that also, anyway, lots of nice little improvements on the performance side of things. If you're using the Canary builds of Android Studio and upgrading your project build files regularly, you're probably already benefiting from a lot of that from a few months back, but it's good to know that it's worth keeping up that effort to upgrade your files because it builds a lot faster. There's a new thing called the KSP, the Kotlin symbol processor, which I think will replace CAPT, or at least, sorry, that's not what's going on there. The KSP, it helps with class symbol processing. So that's compiler internals. I'm not too strong with that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know a whole lot about it, except I hear people talk about it and get excited because faster builds. So once we get KSP, apparently it's going to help with the Cape APT slowness that we've been experiencing and a lot of other things. Anyway, benefits, goes faster. There's been a lot of IDE improvements with Kotlin as well. And if you're not aware, the last news you might want to hear about is that Kotlin's backend compiler is getting a lot faster now. They're building a whole new one. So there's a lot of talk about Kotlin multi-platform projects being twice as fast once we'll be on these new compilers, and that I believe should come this year, although nobody's committed to any dates, as you might expect. I have a lot of notes here on the libraries that have been updated with for Kotlin and Android. I guess the ones you should be aware of, in my opinion, are mostly like if you're using flows or you're not using flows and you're going to be using flows, you should definitely look at shared flow and state flow, which are built for people who use flows to store and propagate data in their app. So that's a big improvement to what we had a year ago. So shared flow and state flow are sort of the new ways of making sure that your models, reactive pipeline, all that stuff is really neatly wired. If you've watched any of my talks on MVI, you probably heard of this stuff, but anyway. Lifecycle management will be improved. So there's all sorts of new things that will help you deal with Android's lifecycle better that are coming. And last little note I have here that I want to talk about is that the Kotlin Android synthetics are going away officially now. If you've used those, you should be using view bindings instead now. Otherwise, you're going to be in a world of hurt when they take it away. But if you're using Kotlin Android synthetics, you might be in a world of hurt already and you don't know about it. So switch to view bindings. They're much better. Yeah, that's about it for Kotlin stuff. Next up, Jetpack. What's new in Jetpack? Way too much. I can't go through the whole list. We're going to be sitting here for like a half hour if I do so. The things to note is they change slightly the definition between alpha, beta, and stable. With Jetpack libraries, in general, using them straight out of alpha in production is not a big deal, is what I want to share here. That's been true for years now. The definition they changed this year and last few months is the meaning of beta. Beta now means feature stabilization. So the features are being stabilized. The APIs are not supposed to change. And it used to be that beta meant no API changes whatsoever. They've amended that slightly to say, we will allow ourselves to change the API signatures for critical reasons, of which community feedback is one. So I think there's been a few cases in the past where some of the beta libraries were sort of being criticized heavily by the community, maybe because people don't really look at the libraries until they hit beta. So they allowed themselves to basically change the APIs slightly in beta. So yeah. Camera X, there's a whole bunch of new stuff in there. If you use the camera for your apps, look into it. I'm not going to go into detail about what happened there. Constraint and motion layout are now stable. So that's actually a pretty big deal. Now you might be saying, Etienne, constraint layout, motion layout, the new stuff is Compose. Well, also, they're going to be hitting Compose this year, and they've already started a lot of the work for that. So take a look at those. They're interesting, and the work going in to Jetpack Compose with constraint and motion layout is super interesting as well. Motion layout is less integrated than constraint layout is in Compose, but that's worth checking out. And I'm gonna move on to the next slide. Gradle plugins. I've talked about how the DSL and there's been a lot of performance improvements. The other things that you might care about with the Android Gradle plugin is that you can now use something called non-transitive R classes. So if you're deep into resource management and you've looked at how all the different styles and things that you import into your project are being sort of carried over, it's a bit messy. With non-transitive, oh, did I hear somebody talk? All right, so it might have just been audio feedback. Anyway, so there's the yeah, so that's an improvement that's been added. So you can now basically say only use my R types and don't import the ones from the libraries, and that improves things in different ways. So that's something to be aware of if you're probably not going to play with that too much, but it's always interesting to know that these things are there if ever you hit a problem with the R classes. Lots of lint integration improvements. That should just be something you'll notice at some point, that the lint suggestions are getting better. I've already mentioned that the DSL has been better documented on developer.android.com, and mostly a lot of performance improvements are in the pipeline and have been applied already. So that's what to keep in mind. Okay, so we're going to get to the point where we're going to go into a bit more of an interactive demo. We're at 25-minute mark here, so it's going to get a bit more interesting than just me blabbing along. Just point of news, not too long ago, we just got, on the 28th of May, we just got the Android Studio Bumblebee build. So as you might know, they've switched from numbering schemes to using proper names now, just to give us a better idea of like where we are in the progression of the IDE. So this winter we had the Arctic Fox, and now we have Bumblebee for the summer. So that's the build I'm going to be using to demo some of the new features that we have in the IDE. Mostly the more flashy stuff, and the stuff I'm going to be mostly focusing on right now, is design tool add-ons. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to launch my IDE and share that window, and we're going to start looking at all the new goodness. All right, just let me swap here. Let me just get familiar with this little app. Right. Screen share? Yes. How do I switch my screen share? Give me a second. I'll figure that out. Yeah, how do I reshare my, I guess I'll stop sharing and I'll reshare. There we go. Jet News. Yeah. If somebody can just keep an eye on my stream, if ever that you notice that I'm playing around with pop-up windows that are not showing up in the stream, I'd like somebody to just give me a heads up. I think we should be good, though. Everything is pretty much in screen nowadays. All right, cool. So hopefully this is readable. It is on my own stream, so I think the text is readable again. Yeah?
Yeah, it's good.
All right, super. All right. So let's see. We're having bleed in from another conversation from somewhere else. If somebody can sort of fix that, that'd be nice. All right. All right. Oh, wait, I see what's going on here. Let me just, all right, cool. I was getting conversations from the other app, people walking next to me and virtually. All right, cool. So what are we doing today? Right now I'm going to start by showing off the new features we have with, well, new. These things are relatively new. If you've played around with Compose already, you might be aware of a few of these things, but they've been improving them incrementally for the last few months. So some of the stuff I'm guessing some of us are already fairly aware of, but we're just going to play around a little bit. So now I've got the Jet News app set up. So the Jet News app is a sample app that you can find on the Compose sample website, the official one from Google. So this is something you can start off on your own with your own IDE. So the first thing we're looking at is the Compose preview. So the way the Compose works, if you're building your components and you want to sort of see what they look like, you don't have to launch your app right away. So Compose has this very neat at preview annotation. So when you have a composable function, by adding the at preview function, annotation on that function, you're going to get this screen right here on the right, where you can have a nice little preview of what's going on. So that's been around for a while. What's kind of nice is that, it recompiles and sort of, you can basically see these changes pretty quickly. So if I say, I don't know, I'm changing padding here. So I'm going to say 32 for this. Save. Normally when I'm hitting save, I can see at the bottom here that's re-rendering the 5 previews. I think it's going to get pretty spammy in a second on the right pane right here. It's going to start changing that padding all around, but we should see this happen in any second now. Sometimes these things are slightly slower than you'd like them to be. This is part of stuff that's being worked on performance-wise. But we can see it changed right now. So it took a few seconds, right? But we can see that the padding around these is now basically double what it was a few seconds ago. So that's effectively what we can see with the previewer. Now, there's a few little affordances here that are kind of interesting to look at. So you have the idea of deploying a preview. So if you want to take, say, I don't know, we'll take something a bit more complex. We're going to go to the article screen, right? And if memory serves, there's a few previews in that pane. No? Screens. That's what we were looking at 2 seconds. All right, well, I'll just go back to the postcards and just like post one of those. So let's just say, okay, we're going to start this guy. So we're going to say, okay, cool. I want to see what this looks like in the actual emulator. So by hitting that button, build is going to go off and it's only going to start that window and put it in the emulator. So that has quite a lot of nice little potential. I'm just going to pop up the emulator. We're going to see this in a sec. Of course, we talked about thermal throttling a few seconds ago, and I think it's another cause of thermal throttling is Android Studio. Sorry. Snarky man. All right. So as you can see, we launched this little view, and that's like, we have it here. But what's nice is that we can interact with it. Like I don't know if it's very clear from the stream. I'm clicking on it now, and we can see it highlight that way. So if we want to test interactions with our little widget, we can definitely do that. We see all the buttons being pressed and all the changes being done. So that's a nice way of previewing on device exactly what's going to happen with our composable view. What else do we have in the previewer? So we have, we can sort of change modes here. So we have a lot of affordances for accessibility. If we want to, we can say, okay, colorblind people, how does this look for them? And then we can sort of look at the different, different ways that our app is going to look for other people. We have, well, that's not super interesting. Yeah, we have the refresh unit. That's about it. Right. So moving on. Let's see. What else do we have here? Right. So, oh yeah, that one's pretty interesting. So we now have support, and I think that one's fairly fresh. So I think nobody's going to have seen this one, or at least it's going to be fairly new for people who haven't used Compose too much. So if you might have heard of something called the layout inspector. It's this little tab at the bottom of the screen right here. And the layout inspector allows you to really see, like have an x-ray vision of how your app is structured and the layout is being built. So right now we have the little card that we had in preview. So we can see it in the layout inspector. What's fun here is that on the left, we can have like really all the little parts of this. Like we see the structure. We can see that it's built as a row. We can see there's an image here. And one of the jazzier effects of the layout inspector is that you can sort of get this decomposed view. So you can do 3D mode. I'm just going to start that right now. So it's probably going to be a bit janky on the stream, but if you see now, what we have is that we can sort of decompose in 3D, like how the view is built. So, that's a whiz-bang effect, but it's kind of nice if you want to really have an X-ray vision of how your app is really structured, right? So we can go back to 3D mode just by hitting this. Right, you can hold space just to pan your screen around. There's little things like that. That's usual stuff that we're used to. You can load overlays, so there's ways of saving them and loading them. That's not something I'm going to demo right now. You can also decide to, show the bounds or not. And yeah, so the layout inspector runs alongside the app, so you can also stop it and start it. It can sort of be a bit performance intensive if you have a slower machine and the view is very complex. But yeah, that's basically what we get with the layout inspector. Yeah. There's also the option of stopping the live updates with the layout inspector nowadays. So if you're playing with your device, the idea is that if you can see the changes happening live, but that can also lead to a bit more performance issues. So you can turn that on and off nowadays. But I think if I click it, you see that the layout inspector is also updating. So that's interesting, especially if you want to see how things are happening live. So layout inspector is a pretty neat little tool. And it's fun to have it for compose now, so that's new. Let's see. So next, I've already demoed the idea of deploying a preview to device, so that's pretty useful. One thing I wanted to demo, and I'm not sure it's going to work, is the live edit of literals. So one of the other things that you can do nowadays is that you can sort of, depending on how your view is built, your compose view is built, you can sort of edit text live and see what it would look like. So I'm going to try to run that right now from another pane. I had it ready earlier, and the project was giving me a little bit of difficulty. You know what? Just to keep things interesting, I'm going to jump back to the presentation I already have ready with little animations, just in case some of these things didn't work. Yeah. Before I do that, yeah, there's one more thing I want to show before I jump back to that other to the main presentation. Some of the new things that we have are I'm going to stop let me just stop things here right now. Where was it? There. So I'll stop the inspector so that we get our performance back. Cool. So things that are new that you might have not really known about is that you have a lot more like stuff that you might have been used to in the old emulator. You can control a lot of things, and you couldn't necessarily do it all from the Android Studio window, and that's been upgraded now. So what you can do is just by pressing these three little buttons here, you get all the options that you might have been used to that were difficult to access in the past. So that's been fixed. All the different sensor controls and all of that stuff. So that's now part of the system. And that's actually not showing because I'm only showing a window. So I'm going to, anyway, the idea is that you get access to all the extended controls that you would have. I'm just going to jump back to the keynote presentation so I can show you this in all its glory. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go back to sharing keynote. There we go. All right. So what I mentioned a few seconds ago is this, right, new feature of, there we go. So that's literal edit, a live edit of literals. So you can see in the demo here that you can change the DP of certain things. You can change the actual text. So all the constant effectively of your composable, you can go and live change them in the code and see the impact of that in both the preview and the emulator. So that's pretty powerful. And you know, you might find this a little bit slow when you try it yourself. Although, as far as like Android developers, we're used to much slower, so it's not bad at all. Maybe we're not at editing the DOM live type interaction speeds, but I think it's pretty clear that we're going to have something close to that in the next few months, I believe, because there's a lot of performance improvements being done to Compose now that it's hit like a release. So I've heard a lot of good stuff about how the performance is going to be probably a lot better in the next few months. And next we have extended controls of the emulator window, which I was trying to show you all. So basically just saying you have all the controls that you would be used to have in the emulator at a touch of a button that were not available apparently as much as they should have been. To be honest, I don't use that stuff that often. So it was news to me that I couldn't actually access it from Android Studio, but that's been fixed. So that's cool. Other things that are kind of interesting that are a little bit further away from the UI. So if you've used Work Manager, you can use the background task inspector, a new component in Android Studio now, to debug what's going on with your workers, which is something that's typically not super easy to debug. So this is a really neat feature. I encourage you to check it out if you have if you use the Worker Manager in your projects at all. We also have a new memory profiler. So they've consolidated the memory profiler UI for different recording activities, like things like think heap dumps and recording Java Kotlin and native memory allocation. So that's all bundled together now. So you can get a lot better of an idea what's going on with memory with your app, because sometimes it feels like you need a PhD to understand what's going on in that stuff, to be honest. But the tools have been improved a fair bit, so that's kind of cool. So I definitely recommend you check this out if you're working on performance in your app at any point. And that's basically what we have these days. So I don't know if the video demo was running, but you can sort of see what it looks like. There's a lot more improvements in Android Studio. To be honest, like I'm looking at the time, and I sort of knew this would take a fair amount of time. So I encourage you to just go check the release notes for I/O. But these are the more noticeable ones that I've really uh, personally been really keen on. And I have like a couple of slides of what about this other cool stuff that you did not really pick up on, and I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about it. Anybody that knows me knows that I got into Android development because I love gadgets. So when the first Android watches came out, I was all over that stuff, right? Like I loved them. I wanted to try them out. And then I got one and I noticed that the battery life was something like a day at most, and that the UIs were fairly janky even when they came out. And well, I tried to give it its chance, but as any iWatch owner or Apple Watch owner will tell you, there's only really one nice wearable watch, maybe two if you count Fitbit, which sort of goes to the announcement that Google made at Google I/O about the watches, Wear OS is going to be combined with Tizen. I suspect that what this means is that they're going to import a lot of the skinability that Tizen has into Android Wear or Wear OS, sorry, because, well, if you've heard about what runs under the hood with Tizen, it's very unlikely that anybody would want to import that into a project for performance reasons. I've honestly only heard stories, but if you've ever worked with Linux, it used to have a window manager in the 90s called, what was it called? It had this really funky little name, Enlightenment. And there's this whole saga of how Enlightenment, the 90s operating window dressing for Linux that looked really funky, let's just put it politely, turned into Tizen over the years. There's this like really long saga. If you're ever curious, like look it up, Google it up. It's like mind-boggling how this system that used to be used for Linux and developed by this like a few curmudgeon type people turned into like a wearable OS, and that's what Samsung has been using in their watch. So anyway, it's most likely that Samsung is going to have a say as to what's going to happen with Wear and a few of the features that we're going to see in it. But right now, I'm not super interested by Wear for the simple reason that there's no hardware to run it. As far as we know, there's nothing new on the horizon that will say, hey, you could have a watch that's as performant as an Apple Watch. The latest system on chip that exists for watches that could run Android is like a specific type of Snapdragon, the 4100, 41,000 or 4100, whatever. And that one's already sort of obsolete, and they've released it a year and a half ago, and only one watch has used it ever. And Qualcomm has not basically announced any public plans to release anything new. So it was a bit of a one-off, and the future doesn't look all that great, except most people suspect that Google's going to announce their own silicon at some point, and then maybe near future this year, that would power these watches. That's what most of the tech bloggers are saying, but that's really not clear if that's true for now. So I would suggest to put an eye, like have an eye on what's happening with Wear. They added Compose support. They've added a little few things to build out apps on the devices, but really nobody has these, and there's no new device that's been announced that would look sexy enough that you could expect having it public for this. So I would just skip it. There's a few other things, but yeah, I'm just gonna end it here. We're at the 42-minute mark on my timer. So thank you very much. If you have any questions or any things that you've heard about at I/O that you would like us to discuss quickly, I'd be happy to answer any questions from the floor. So thanks again, and I pass it on to everybody in the assistants.